Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Dan Cordalicchio. Welcome to the Destination Health Podcast. We have a very special guest today. You're going to love our conversation. Want to welcome Michael Ostrolenk. Mike, welcome to the program today.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be on.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to this. Let me give you a little bit about Mike. Very interesting. I have a very abbreviated bio. As I just said to Mike offline, I could probably go on for a half an hour. But Mike has been exploring the relationship between post-conventional living, transformational leadership, optimizing health, and regenerative paradigms his whole life. I love that. His interest in human growth and personal development began when he was 9 years old, tender age of 9 years old, and worked with a psychotherapist, Pat Lawson, learning biofeedback, meditation, and guided imagery. Master's degree in transpersonal counseling psychology from John F. Kennedy University, postgraduate training in somatic psychology, which is what we're going to be talking about today, from the California Institute for Integral Studies, transpartisan social entrepreneur. I got to ask you about this. Who's a leading expert in the field of transpartisan public policy, successfully convened policy initiatives on transparency, privacy, defense, foreign policy, national security, 2001, 2020. If that's not busy enough, studied Taekwondo, Jiu-Jitsu, Krav Maga, master coach for SEAL Fit, Unmeetable Mind Academy. He's a master coach for Spartan 7 Roundtable, Navy SEALs, Dan Cirillo and Chris Smith, and Director of Human Resilience on the Aperian Zoo, which we had Mikra on last week, where he works with medical and psychological staff. Mike, thank you very much for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. If it's anything like the ones we've been having offline, it's going to be very exciting.
It's going to be a great conversation. So I have to ask you, before we get into the somatic psychology, what's transpartisan social entrepreneur? What did you do with that? That sounds fascinating. What's going on?
Well, so it might be of use for me to remind your listening audience, because you've kind of went through my biography, that I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist. So I see things systemically. So when I did, and I still continue to do public policy as a consultant, I look very systemically at things. I look at us as Americans as a broad family. So that's kind of my framework. What I do is I get hired by nonprofits and foundations to help build out what I call transpartisan coalitions, building bridges between liberals, conservatives, libertarians, and progressives on a wide variety of issues. You've named a few. I've done healthcare, I've done transparency in government, I've done foreign policy, defense policy, cybersecurity, wide variety of different issues. But the basic foundation is that no matter what your political stripe is, where you find yourself on the ideological spectrum, and I say the spectrum is actually too narrow and limited, it's not a great way of discussing or explaining the complexity of human life, but that's what we use. Mm-hmm. So I help bring together the quote unquote the left and the right on these issues to help form coalitions and campaigns. And I've been doing that, as you mentioned, for about 20 years.
Wow, that, and you know what, in today's market, that is so important, to talk to each other and to come to some type of, meeting place, that is very important. As you know, I'm into politics in addition to, and, to bring people in from the other side, and get them to understand your views and you understand their views. That's when our country moves forward significantly.
Completely agree. And one thing I might suggest is there's not two sides, there's multiple sides. That's why this kind of left-right paradigm is so restricted. And I've been fortunate to work with some amazing facilitators over the years, because one of the things we've done is we brought leaders from these various groups, and these groups people would know about because you hear about them on television and talk radio, on retreats, 2 or 3 day professionally facilitated retreats to do exactly what you just said. Humanize the political process, find common ground, and through that finding of common ground, launch campaigns. And it's all about the relationships. That's why I preface this conversation by saying I'm a family therapist, because that's kind of the way I look at this. If you start building relationships as a family, you can move forward. Yeah,
I love that. Although this is not a political podcast, we could probably go on for this for 5 hours. So
that's true.
I'm going to put that aside, and we'll think about doing a podcast as such at
Okay.
another time for that. But today we're going to talk about body somatic approach to coaching and psychology. What is a body somatic approach? What does that mean?
So most conventional schools of psychology and coaching work at the mental level. You change the scripts, cognitive behavioral if you're looking at psychology, or scripting if you're looking at coaching. So you just change how people think. Well, that can be useful and helpful, but it's too narrow because we are embodied beings. We are not just, from heads. We have full bodies. And for change to take place and be sustainable over the long term, it seems to be a better approach is to include the whole person, not just the way they think. And a lot of the, psychologically speaking, at least, a lot of people who are dealing with trauma, especially trauma that happened to them when they're young, like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, they didn't have a verbal self sense. There was not a mental representation of themselves that was as active and viable as they have now as an adult. Mm-hmm. Therefore, a lot of the trauma that occurred to them is locked in their physical body. And the only way to deal with that trauma in this case is through the physical body. You can't just change the thinking. And it's not just limited to trauma. I just use that as an example. A lot of the change when I work with clients, a lot of people who work with clients from a somatic or body-based approach recognize the limits of just talking therapy mm-hmm. and cognitive behavioral therapy. You have to have a much more holistic or comprehensive approach.
I find this fascinating. When you talk about traumas, what are some of the traumas that you see in your private practice?
Well, so I practice as a coach now, so I don't deal with people with trauma per se. I mean, people have trauma, but I don't, mm-hmm. It's not within my scope of practice. As a trained psychotherapist, I did work with people with trauma. So I'll give you some examples of people I have dealt with in the past. Sexual abuse is one. Mm-hmm. Physical abuse would be another. And even mental emotional abuse. So you'd have a caregiver, a parent who's screaming and yelling at the child. They might not physically contact them, but they're emotionally, mentally abusive. All those things, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental, emotional abuse, gets locked into the nervous system mm-hmm. inside the physical body. So you can't just think your way out of that kind of traumatic experience. You have to go through the body in order to undo that kind of damage.
So you have to go through the physical aspect mm-hmm. in addition to the psychological aspect. And we're talking about self-management now. If you're in a particular state, you have to recognize what state you're in, right? And then how do you change that? How do you change the state? What are some of the tools when you're coaching? What are some of the tools that you use?
And I think it's really important to make a distinction between the coaching and the therapy. So we're going to talk strictly about coaching.
Coaching, correct.
Yeah, not about therapeutic work with trauma victims.
Correct.
So, and the thing you said just a second ago is key, awareness. So first of all, the client needs to be aware of their present day state. And the term I use is the embodied gestalt, the totality of the experience that they have that very moment. In this case, let's say when they're triggered, they're having a conversation with their spouse, their partner, their workmate, a self-conversation, and there's a triggering that occurs, and there's a whole psychophysiological response or reaction in this case. Mm-hmm. They need to be aware of what that is. For instance, and I'll make some of the stuff I'm going to have to make up because I don't know, we're not talking about any individual case. So I'm just going to make some broad generalizations.
Absolutely.
But, when someone's triggered, most likely there's going to be changes in respiration. Mm-hmm. Some people, their breathing will get restricted, can become shallow, and most people already are chest breathers. So it's even more restrictive in the chest region than it was even before they were triggered. If it's not restricted in breathing, maybe it's an increase in respiration. So they're getting excited. There's a sympathetic activation as an example. So just breath can induce a certain state. Mm-hmm. Not only breath, but they want to be aware of like the structure of their physical body. So they're triggered, something happens with their breath, they notice it. Well, most likely, whether it's gross or subtle, something will happen to their physical structure. And I'll give you an example. So let's just say you have an individual who tends to be unconfident, especially when they're triggered by a certain person in their life. And their structural reaction to that trigger is to collapse. So
Mm.
their shoulders collapse. And, you know, you as a chiropractor probably seen a lot of people kind of walking around with their heads down.
Right,
And I
right,
don't mean due to an accident, I mean just like their natural posture,
right.
kind of head down, shoulders collapse. Well, you know, as a doctor, that what that does, if that's your natural reaction, and that's actually how you carry yourself most of the time, that is actually restricting your breathing anyways, that whole posture. Well, we know psychophysiologically that if you restrict your breathing, most likely you do that because you're trying to tame a certain feeling. Because if you collapse yourself, you're less likely to feel something. So it's like a defense mechanism most likely that person learned when they were a kid.
Hmm.
Because, you know, if you're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old and you're dealing with, let's say, an adult, you don't have any kind of power. The best thing you can do is either learn how to collapse and hold in that feeling because it's too dangerous to express it in most cases, or in some cases you might express it, but if you're a kid, most likely inappropriately, and that will get you in trouble. But the point is like you want your client, first of all, to become aware of their respiration, their
Hmm.
breath, you know, what happens when they're triggered, and then the structure of their physical body. How does their body show up when they're triggered by another person or self-talk? So those are two examples of a somatic approach, awareness-wise, that I would have a client work through or be aware of
Hmm.
in our work together.
You know, I find this interesting because breath and breathing, with whatever I'm reading, keeps coming up as, you know, something that individuals should do. Can you talk a little bit more about breathing?
Definitely so. So, you know, the first thing you said is awareness. But when
Right,
I'm working with the client, I want them to be aware of how they react to a certain situation.
right.
Then the next step is actually changing their state, and multiple different ways of doing it, at least four that we'll talk probably about today. One of them is through breath. So if they are in a sympathetic arousal, they're getting kind of
Hmm.
excited, they can do what we call a tactical breath, which is slow, deep abdominal breathing, which you know will kick on their parasympathetic nervous system, helps them relax, and then kicks in their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's more the human brain, so
Hmm.
they can think more clearly and take better decisions. Because
Right.
as you know, when people are kind of sympathetically aroused to the extreme, they're less likely to make good decisions because they're not thinking long term, and they're most likely they might say something they might regret. So just even breath is a way to manage that.
Yes, I find that fascinating because in functional neurology, we talk about the prefrontal cortex and
Mhm.
dampening it because your executive functions, your decision
Yep,
making functions that you have, and if you're in that hyperarousal state, it's not the best that you
exactly.
want to do that. Now, talk about self-talk when it comes to the state changes because we're always saying, oh, I can't do this or I can do this, and I find that fascinating too. What is that self-talk?
So, and it's really interesting because, as a meditator, since I was a little kid, I've been aware of my self-talk forever, for a long, long time. And I find it interesting that a lot of people are not even aware that they have a self-conversation all the time.
Right.
And not only not a lot of people aware that there's a conversation going on inside their head, they're not even necessarily aware of how negative it can be. So when
Mm-hmm.
you start having clients be aware of their self-conversation and how negative it is, they can start seeing why they act the way they do. You know, unconfident, passive,
Mm-hmm.
non-aspirational, all that kind of good stuff because of their self-talk. So, if you have an individual who walks around that way, you can work on their breath, you can work on their structure because it
Mm-hmm.
shows up in those things too. But you can also work on their self-talk. So first of all, they become aware of their negative self-talk. They learn how to interdict that,
Mm-hmm.
stop it, and
Mm-hmm.
replace it with positive self-talk as a basic activity. There's an advanced practice, which we can get into later, but at least the first thing you want people to be able to do is interdict their negative self-talk and replace it with a more positive self-talk.
So when you're interdicting, you're just stopping it right then and there, and now you're going to change your state, and you're going to put something more positive that is going to, elevate your mood, or
Yep.
you're going to start feeling better. You're going to, you're not going to be as depressed. You're going to feel more confident in that. you know. Can you,
Exactly.
can you give me an example with that?
Yeah. So let's the example I gave earlier about the kind of the collapsed, unconfident person. Let's kind of have them as our exemplar. Okay. So let's just say they walk around and they work in a particular business, and they because of their lack of confidence and their highly negative self-talk, they don't put themselves out in a way that would allow them to get a raise, get a promotion, to be seen by others. They kind of hide themselves, and the collapsing is like a perfect physical example of them trying to like hide. Okay, so and the way I would work with this person is through the breath, through the structure, and through the self-talk. So I'd want them first of all to become aware of the conversation they're having in their head. And we'll make this up because we're making someone up, but they might be having a conversation in their head saying something like, I could never do that. I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. All that kind of self-talk, which is negative. So I want them, first of all, to become aware of that. Say become aware of that conversation in their head starts happening. I would have them say stop, literally, not out loud, but inside their own head. Okay. And then come up with a positive mantra, a mantra from the Indian yogic tradition, but it doesn't have to be any kind of metaphysics or spiritual nature, whatever their mantra is that induces a more positive state mentally. I want them to repeat that over and over again. So they're getting out of their negative self loop, replacing with a positive self loop. And you want to ground that with the breath and the structural work. So for instance, let's just say I say, it's me and I'm collapsed and I'm depressed. I don't mean clinically depressed, but, I'm confident. And I say, stop inside my own head. And I notice the negative self-talk, like I suck, I'm no good. And I say, I'm going to replace it. I am quite capable of doing X, whatever X happens to be. And then I'm going to remember that Michael, my coach, says, breathe fully. So not only am I going to have these positive conversations in my head, I'm going to breathe fully. So I'm kicking in the parasympathetic nervous system, activating the prefrontal cortex, the executive function, so I can think more clearly, be more relaxed. And I'm subtly working through the collapsed structure and bringing it back. Now, not in a like I'm in the military and I'm going to stick my chest out kind of way. But like you really subtly, so your shoulders start coming back, your chest slowly starts to rise, you're more relaxed, your shoulders come down, you kind of maybe notice this jaw structure, maybe it's a little tight, you relax that. So you're taking management of that part of your body which is collapsed, and you're uncollapsing it, and you're getting in a more positive physical structure. And there's some great research out of Harvard that if you do that Wonder Woman position, pretty much what I'm describing, you actually increase your testosterone, whether you're male or female.
Interesting.
And actually increases your confidence. So just by changing your structure, your breath, and self-talk, you can actually increase your confidence.
I find that fascinating. Now, when you're doing this, do you do this multiple times during the day? Whenever you're kind of, whenever you have that negative self-talk going on, do you do it each time that comes up, or you do it one time a day? What do you recommend when you're coaching?
So I would recommend my client at first just become aware of what they do and how they show up. Once they start intervening by the breath structure and self-talk, do it all the time. Because, like a muscle that you want to lift and get stronger, you have to continually practice this because you're changing one habit, which no longer serves you, with a new habit. And it's not going to become a habit until you habituate it by doing it multiple times a day, multiple times a week, multiple times over the months. Because ultimately what you want to be able to do is have that breath, that posture, and that self-conversation be your natural way of being in the world, as opposed to a new habit you're trying to generate. It becomes you as opposed to something new you're trying to create for yourself.
Now, do you use imagery with this? Because I noticed, I'm looking over here at your bio, and you did guided imagery. Yeah. So if you're, it could be anything. My son's ready to go onto the ice, and he's got this negative chatter going on, and he's like, oh man, I'm going to have a bad game today, and he's like, oh, no, I know I'm going to interdict. I'm going to do some breathing. I'm going to do some positive self-talk. Do you use imagery now at this point in order to kind of erase that negative self-talk, that negative image in your mind? Do you use the imagery?
Definitely so. So at SEALFIT, we call it the Big Four mental toughness. Imagery is one of the big four. And it's really important that you see yourself, as well as have the conversation in your head, as well as the breath and the structural changes, see yourself accomplishing whatever task you're trying to do
Right.
at 100% success. Now, this is not magical thinking. So you actually have to do whatever it is to develop your own confidence and ability to do whatever the practice is. So your son actually has to go play hockey and practice and
Right.
practice and practice. So it's not just he can change his breath, structure, self-talk, and do some guided imagery, and he's going to be an amazing hockey player. But you add on to the actual practicing of hockey of those four things, and that increases the likelihood of success in that sport.
Right, because the mind doesn't know if you're imagining it and you're meditating on it, your brain it's happened in reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's happened. So it's not this delineation between, oh, it didn't happen, I'm just kind of thinking about it, because as we think, we do become. So you want to be able to have an individual, when you're coaching, when they're doing this imagery, you want them to have that positive. I find this fascinating. And for an Italian-American boy from northern New Jersey that does meditate, and all my friends are laughing at me right now, Mike. Nice. I could tell you that. I find this to be an invaluable life's experience when you're going through a tough time. Even not a tough time. It could be anything. You want to open up a business. You want to have a better relationship with your wife, with your husband, with your children, with your mother and father. I think this is an invaluable situation. And I remember there were times in my life where I was doing this and not really studying it. If you're playing a particular sport, you're going through a rough, patch, and, you're kind of thinking in your mind, what are you going to do? How are you going to get better? And you use this type of a situation, and then lo and behold, the next bunch of games, you're right, you're rocking and rolling at that point.
Yeah, and ultimately, like if you're going to use sports as the analogy, you want to get into a flow state. You want to become unconsciously competent. So you're not even thinking about it, because when you think about stuff, there's a possibility of messing up the thinking process and not translating the thoughts to the actual physical skill. So eventually, you want to get to that point of flow state. But until you get there, you're setting up all the kind of the pillars to make that more possible by learning to manage yourself, your inner states, changing your states through breath structure, self-talk, and guided imagery.
I find this fascinating. So let's go to inner resources, and let's go to gratitude. Do you have your when you're coaching, do you have them journal for gratitude and so forth?
Yes.
And how does this tie into this? Because you can what are you excited about during the day? What are you grateful for during the day, and so forth? So there's a morning routine, I'm assuming, that you have your, when you're coaching somebody. Talk about this, gratitude.
One of my favorite journals is a 5-minute gratitude journal, and it literally takes 3 minutes in the morning and 2 minutes at night, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And it's so important because we live in a really challenging transitional time, especially with COVID and killer wasps and asteroids coming down and UFOs, and all kinds of interesting things going on in our world. That it's important to wake up and start your day with the right mindset. And I find working with my clients that opening your heart with gratitude is the best way to start your day, because it opens your heart, it makes you smile, it makes you realize that even all the challenges that you're facing, there's at least one thing, if not more, that you can be grateful for. Right. And it changes the way you relate to yourself, and it can change the way you relate to other people. And it's like it can spread, So one of the first practices I'll have them do is just to themselves acknowledge in their journal what they're grateful for. Mm-hmm. And more advanced practice is actually to share that gratitude with that individual that they're grateful for in person, if it's possible, via text, email, Zoom, whatever the technology would allow, because it's not just about them. Ultimately, it's about the other person too, and the relationship. And if you wake up, you're grateful for something your mother did, or your father did, or your sister, or your best friend yesterday or 20 years ago, and you call them and you say, I just want to thank you for whatever it happens to be. man, you just might have just made their day, their week, and then
Right.
it spreads out to anyone in their life too.
You know, it's kind of like this mushroom effect where it just kind of goes
Yeah.
like this. And what else do you talk about if you're going through a morning routine? You know, you're doing journaling for gratitude. Are you journaling for anything else?
Yeah, so I wear different hats, so we have different journaling systems with different programs that I work for or run.
Uh-huh.
But generally speaking, there's a few things that I always have or encourage my clients to do. One is gratitude. Obviously, we just talked about that. Another is recognizing the need of your physical body. So drink some water, get rehydrated.
Mm-hmm.
Some movement practices. And I don't mean like you fall out of bed and you go do CrossFit, but like, get up
Right.
and do a couple yogic moves or some Tai Chi or, just some slow, natural movements. It could be MoveNat if you want to use MoveNat. Just something that gets your energetic body moving, your physical body moving. I think that's really important as well as three things that I recommend clients do first thing in the morning.
Talk a little bit more about MoveNet. Spend a few minutes on that.
So MoveNet is founded by Erwan Lecour.
Mm-hmm.
Erwan is now an American citizen, but he was originally French.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the father of the natural movement system. And I got certified in it quite a few years ago. And it's an amazing system because it basically recognizes that there are about 9 basic human movements that we are not actually taught to do, but they're basic movements that if you do properly based on gravity, and this would be right up your alley as a chiropractor, if you do it based on gravity, you're less likely to create injuries for yourself and wear and tear over the long haul. So for instance, the first day of training, you're taught to crawl. And I remember my first day, I'm like, dude, I know how to crawl. And I got
Yeah,
down,
you're
I
like, I'm
crawled.
not doing this at all, right?
Yeah. But it was the funniest thing because like after 10 minutes, I'm like going, wow, I really don't know how to crawl properly. Like I can
Right.
crawl, but I
Right.
wasn't able to crawl appropriate to my body structure, bone, muscle, and gravity. So like I learned how to crawl. And then you walk and run, lift, carry, throw, all those different kind of movements. But you go from very basic movements and you complexify them over time. And you learn actually how to move appropriate to gravity and like I said, lessen the likelihood of injury, repetitive injury, and things along those lines. But the ideal, though, is to be strong in service of others.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you find yourself, if there's a fire in your home, could you carry your kid out the window?
Right.
Or if you're in a fire experience and someone's in a wheelchair, could you pick them up, throw them over your shoulder, and carry them out of the burning building? Or why? I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but that's the basic question Erwan asks.
Right.
Are you strong enough to serve those in your community if ever need to be? And also, can you do it in such a way that you lessen the chances of getting injured? And it's a great system, and I recommend anyone that I work with coaching to do that as the basis for anything else they might do. So like, learn that before you do CrossFit, learn that before you do SEALFIT, learn that before
Mm-hmm.
you study a martial art, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting. Interesting. So you talk about forgiveness and apology in
Yep.
this realm of inner resources, the
Yep.
spiritual state. Can you talk a little bit more about forgiveness and apology?
Yeah. So, in terms of inner resources, and maybe if you wouldn't mind me stepping back and let's
Go
use an
right ahead.
example. I'll use an example. So, one way to think about the body is a means of developing inner resources to deal with life's challenges.
Right.
And let's just say who we're dealing with COVID right now. Let's just say, your partner is not with you because they're sick or they're traveling, and because of COVID, you're not with them at this present moment, right? And your heart longs for them. Maybe you haven't been married 20 years and you don't really care, but it's like
Right.
it's a new relationship and you care, or hopefully you're married 20 years and you care. But
That's right.
so we talked about self-management. So, your heart longs for that person and you could change your state. You could, change your breath, your structure, your self-talk, do imagery, and just make yourself feel better so you're not so distracted by the fact that the person's not there. That's possible. Well, another way of thinking about it is as a spiritual maturation process. If you look at Bhakti yoga, it's the yoga of longing. You long for God in the yoga tradition, as an
Mm-hmm.
example. Well, imagine if your longing for this other person is not because there's some dysfunction inside of you, you're lacking something, but but it's more of a spiritual process of unfolding, of wanting to deeply connect with this person. And the skill is actually to sit with that longing and not
Mm-hmm.
to change the state,
Right.
and develop the capacities to be with that deep longing, which is painful. But as an inner resource, the longer you can sit with that, the more mature you can become, which allows you to sit with other types of noble pains that are part of the life process. So I'll use that. I'll kind of start there. And
Mm-hmm.
then you can look at forgiveness, apology, gratitude, appreciation, some of these other sentiments as also spiritual skills through the body that you want to develop if you want to have more intimacy with another person.
Mm-hmm.
So we've already talked about gratitude, but let me actually talk a little bit more about gratitude. So, I said the first part of gratitude is just being aware of who you're grateful for and put it in your journal. Second part, a more advanced practice, is actually sharing that with that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's fascinating about that is I've had a lot of clients who are both shy in expressing that. They're nervous about expressing it, and or if it's expressed to them, they're a little bit shy and they quickly change the topic because they're not used to receiving gratitude, and or they're not used to giving gratitude.
Right.
So being shy, being in that state of kind of unknown, uncertainty, a little nervous, that's actually can lead to spiritual maturation if you can encourage the client to be with, either as a giver or receiver, of
Right.
that uncomfortableness openly with that other person.
Right.
So if you said to me, you said something really nice, kind, about some gratitude you had for me, and I like, okay, I'm going to change this. I'm going to change it. Thank you, Dan, and I change the subject. Or I could be like, wow, this makes me really uncomfortable. Well, I'm just going to be with that uncomfortable feeling, and I'm going to be appreciative of your gratitude to me. And I'm going to share with you how grateful I am of you being grateful to me. And it could be a process that goes on for a few minutes where we just kind of give gratitude back and forth.
Right.
And we sit with that uncomfortable, possibly uncomfortable feeling. I don't know how you feel about it, but you could share with me. And that deepens our intimacy.
Right.
So there's a way of not looking away, not changing the subject, being with a certain feeling state that can mature us spiritually. But it's inside the body, because gratitude is like a heartfelt thing, which probably has effects on respiration and muscle tone. So structure comes
Right.
in too.
Right. So you're just modifying your state, whether it's physical and whether it's emotional. It seems like this is so fascinating to me, and you're getting great results with when you're coaching.
Yeah, it's really cool. You talked about my policy work, and policy work can be a little bit hag banging, because
to
you're
say to say the least.
yeah, one step forward, 500 steps back.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's amazing when I hear back from my clients who marriages improves, or relationship at work improve, or their relationship with their kids improve,
Right.
because they're doing some of the things that you and I are talking about.
Yeah, that's just so important. And for our listeners
Yeah.
today, this is something that you should be doing on a regular basis. Let's talk a little bit about sleep. How does sleep come into all of this?
So my basic intention when I work with clients, and no matter what hat I'm wearing, whatever program I'm working through, is that in order to make mental, emotional changes, it's really important to dial in one's physiology.
Mm-hmm.
So if, for instance, you gave sleep as an example, if you're not sleeping well, we already know the research, even one night of poor sleep sets the stage for cognitive decline the next morning. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
whole host of health issues, which we can get into later. But even, and most of us don't just have one poor night of sleep. We have many poor nights of sleep, or weeks or months worth. And we all know from our own personal experience that we're less likely to show up fully with full cognitive and emotional capacities if we're tired.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So change is hard. Change is harder if you're not sleeping.
Yes.
And it's not just sleep. It's also diet and nutrition.
That was my next question. Where does nutrition come into play?
Exact same thing. I remember working with a client who had sleep issues. And we're actually, let me restate that. They didn't acknowledge sleep issues. They're having relationship issues.
Mm-hmm.
And when we started doing a deep dive, I recognized they had sleep issues and they had food issues. And a lot of their fights with their partner was a result of this, like the insulin spikes, because they weren't
Mm-hmm.
eating well. So when they had a downward trend, when they're like, blood sugar's low, they're grumpy, which means you're not going to relate well with another human being. So
Right.
it wasn't even about their skill, their ability, their capacity to engage with another person. But it wasn't that they lacked the skills to have an intimate conversation. Physiologically, they weren't
Right.
available to have the skills available to them to have that conversation because of their poor nutrition choices. Also, in this case, this particular guy also had sleep issues too. And it was just a downward cycle. So he dialed in both his eating and his sleeping, and his relationship improved.
Right,
As an
because this
example.
is because this is all interrelated.
Of
So
course.
it's your fitness, it's your nutrition, it's your sleep cycle. If you're getting that restful, restorative sleep. What
Exactly.
about stress? Where does stress play in all of this?
So
Oh yeah, we have all these stresses, right?
we
That's
we
what it
do.
is. Modern
Yep,
society.
exactly. And unfortunately, I think our society, our kind of industrial paradigm is stress inducing, chronically stress inducing.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's shifted because of COVID. We have new types of stress. But if you just think about short sleep, hour in traffic, which is stressful in itself, 8 to
Mm-hmm.
10 hours of work day, another hour in traffic, you come home, you're stressed out, you don't have the psychic energy to deal with your kids, your partner, et cetera, et cetera. It's a vicious cycle. Okay, that that's obviously a huge problem. We have different kinds of stresses now with COVID and unemployment and health issues and stuff.
Yes.
Not that we didn't have unemployment before, but different scale of
It was different.
things.
It was
Yeah.
different. Yes.
So stress, the way I work with clients, depending on where you are kind of on the scale of stress, can be good. It's important to stress yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, because that's where the growth comes in.
Right. I was going
But
to say that's where growth is coming.
yeah, but chronic stress is not growth inducing. It's entropic. It collapses the system. It
Right.
actually leads to death and destruction and less ability to function and optimized. So, it's important to learn to manage the stress to go from chronic to acute, because once it's acute, then you can manage it at that very moment. And also recognize that it's not that you want to have a complete comfortable life. I mean, unless you do, that's up to you. But the growth comes from actually putting yourself in somewhat stressful situations where you're stretched emotionally, mentally,
Right.
spiritually, depending on when we can get into different kind of challenges. I have my
Right. What are
clients
some of
do.
the? I mean, it sounds like these are purposeful
Yeah,
challenges that
yeah,
you're
yeah,
putting yourself
yeah,
into.
yeah.
What are some purposeful challenges that you can put yourself into?
Yeah, so you can do physical challenges. So,
Mm-hmm.
you could do a Spartan race, you can do a Tough
Right.
Mudder, you can do, I mean, depending on COVID, I guess there's limitations now. CrossFit workout. I mean, depending on where you are physically, you can
Mm-hmm.
challenge yourself to the next level. So it's a physical and also mental, emotional challenge.
Right.
But you can also do emotional challenges. One of the things I teach my clients is to have crucial conversations. So I have them ask themselves, what conversations are you not having with someone who's important in your life,
Mm-hmm.
and why? And they'll say, oh, I'm not talking to this person because of whatever fear drives them not to have that conversation. Well, let's figure out how to have that conversation, because that's gonna be the thing that emotionally grows you
Mm-hmm.
as an individual. And if it works out well, it'll deepen your connection to that other person.
Right.
So you can also have emotional crucibles, not just physical crucibles. Cold shower is both
Mm-hmm.
emotional, physical, and mental crucible. So
Right.
there are certain things that cross the different barriers. You could do in the spiritual space, perhaps you might do a meditation retreat, like a
Right.
7-day silent meditation retreat. That could be a huge crucible, because, if
Right.
you're not physically um, comfortable sitting still in the same position for long periods of time, that in itself is a crucible. If you're
Right.
not used to sitting quietly in your own thoughts for hours upon a time, that's a crucible. If you're not used to focusing strictly on your breath for many hours at a time, that's a crucible. So a crucible doesn't have to be limited to a particular aspect of your life, like physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. It can cover all of them or multiple of them.
Right. So you're actually putting yourself into these. Talk about silence for a second. That's very important.
I was going to be silent.
I know you were. That's why I came back and I said something, because I saw you. I saw the little smile at the corner of your eyes.
Yeah, that's funny. As a sociocultural phenomenon, we have too much noise in our system.
Uh-huh.
If you go to a gas station, there's a television now while you're pumping gas. You're in an elevator, there's a television or radio. You're in a bar, there's televisions all over the place. There's very little time intentionally in our society for quietude, for silence, for contemplation. It's so important for us as human beings, just for our own sanity, to find that time, just to be with ourselves, our own thoughts, our own breath, and just as important to be in nature.
Right.
So silence could be your own silence, but it doesn't have to be silence around you. You could be in a natural setting, so there's natural noises going on. But you want to, at least for certain periods of the time, limit your limit artificial noises, so you can sit with yourself. Because you're not going to know yourself unless you have silence. Right. You're not going to know your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own sensations.
Right. And I find when I do my silence practice in the morning, I'm having a better day actually, because I'm more focused. I find myself more focused at the task at hand, whether it's at work, whether I want to run a couple of more miles, whether I want to have, whether I want to speak to my wife about, a tough topic, whether I want to, work out with my son. I find that I'm more productive during the course of the day. It's kind of like it grounds me, and then it will propel me to do better, if you will. And it doesn't have to be that I'm doing more, making more money. Like I said, it could be something as simple as, my son's going to be 13 years old, so he and I go like that every now and again, and we have a great relationship. But I'm able to have a better conversation with him, when I'm able to do that.
We started this conversation, and you mentioned awareness, like right after the transpartisan conversation. And I talked about how first step in my work with clients is for them to become aware of how they show up, what I call the embodied gestalt, the totality of how they're triggered in a relationship or self-talk. You can't do that if there's a lot of noise. Eventually learn how to do that with life around you. But at first, the best thing to do is quiet. You sit in a quiet place and you just be with yourself. Like, how am I breathing? How is my posture? How is my self-talk? Eventually, you build up the skill set so you can do that self-awareness. You can have that internal silence, even with a lot of noise around you. But at first, I think it's really important to be able to generate that inner silence by having less noise around you.
Right. Yeah. And you know what? I'm going to share something with you that when I opened up my first office, I was so into, the rugs, what color the rugs are, the walls, ordering all the equipment, the business cards, what were they going to look like, the letterhead, all of that stuff, just kind of ordering and just kind of going through the motions, and here's the material that's going to be handed out to my patients when they're coming in. I realized the night before, it was a Sunday night, I realized the night before I was so busy, and it hit me at night, and I opened up in December. Not a great month to open up any type of business. It was just before the holidays. And I sat down, I went into this, we had this bunker apartment in this house, and I looked at my wife, and she looked at me, she says, what's going on? And I'm just going through the paperwork, we're putting files together. And I went into this room and I closed the lights, and I sat in this white loungy type of a chair that we had. And my first thought was, I'm not mature enough to do this.
Wow.
I said, I'm not mature enough to do this. Mind you, I've been out of chiropractic school. I was very successful in terms of an associateship. I was, if you're good, you're going to attract some good people and you're going to help your patients out. It's different now. It's all on me. Even though I was making decisions, I could have been I was the director of the chiropractic physicians, but now it's different. I said, I'm not mature enough. I said, by the time I get to the office tomorrow at 6:00, I said, I have to be mature enough to do this. And I just sat in silence and I went through what I need to do. And it had nothing to do with the paperwork, Mike, putting together files. It had nothing to do with, am I going to put the business cards here or over here on the front desk? Am I putting the pamphlets, am I hanging them? Am I going to put them in the rooms? It had nothing to do with that. Is room number 1 going to be blue? Room number 2 is going to be yellow. It had nothing. It was me as a person. And I said, I'm not mature enough. By the time I got to the office and I was up the entire night, was I 100% mature enough? No, but let me tell you, I was on my way. And rapidly I became more and more mature the more I spent time figuring, I guess back in the day we would say we were figuring our stuff out. Right. It wasn't stuff. We were, there was another word that we were using, right? I was figuring it out. I was figuring out who I wanted to be in my own office, how I was going to present myself professionally. How was I going to present myself in the community? How was I going to present myself with my wife when we were out to dinner? Because now I'm a small business owner. How am I going to present myself to my family, to friends? Because now it's a different ball game. To me, it was a different ball game. It was something that I took very seriously. And how am I going to present myself to patients? What am I going to do? Again, forget about, you got to fill out, form A, B, and C, and it was such it was something where I felt I was maturing. It was that spiritual maturation that I was going through. And I don't know where I would be if I didn't do that. And you don't know that you're going to do that. I didn't plan on doing that.
It sounds like a self-created rite of passage almost.
Right.
I mean, that's awesome.
And from there, I was able to figure it out, and I was able to figure out who I wanted to be and how I wanted to present myself. Because, you're looking at colleagues, you're looking at friends and how they're doing it. Do you want to do it like this? And, as you go through your associateship, you're saying to yourself, oh my God, I can't believe he's talking about this and in the office and his patients in pain. It was like it was a rite of passage. I grew up and, I thought I was all of that in a slice of bread because of what I'd done prior, and it was nothing like, and it's just to show the importance of what you're talking about to all of our listeners today, because it really, I don't want to say it works, but it's so relevant. And yes, it does work. I think that's important. So let's go over one more topic: unfolding wisdom through the somatic processes. What is that about?
So a couple different ways of thinking about the body. One is that there's an innate intelligence of the body, and we'll start there. Mm-hmm. Okay. So every individual has a natural rhythm to themselves. Now it's an integration of us living in a 24-hour cycle, night and day cycle. So we have circadian rhythms that are based on the sun and light and day, night and day. So that's with all human beings. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, due to artificial light and stimulants and depressants, we don't live within that 24-hour cycle, and there's a lot of health consequences to that. And I would imagine a lot of diabetes, heart disease, cancer can be contributed or related to some connection to the lack of following the day and night cycle. So that there's that general human cycle, which we all should participate in for the benefit of our own health and well-being. Yes. And there's also unique cycles to ourselves that have become aware of and organize our lives around as best as possible within the limits of our social obligations and our business obligations, that most likely would be much more healthy, happy, and productive. And I can give you a few examples if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Give me some examples.
Okay. So if you remove all exogenous chemicals that influence us up or down, like caffeine to wake us up in the morning, alcohol
Mhm.
and marijuana to bring you down, or whatever people use to wake up or bring themselves down at night and during the day. If you remove all that and you just be with your own natural, and you eat well and you're sleeping well, so it's all things being equal, and you start being aware of when is the best time of any particular day to do a particular task based on your own energetics, how you show up,
Right.
and then you can organize your life based on that. So for instance, when are you best at focused tasks? When are you best at creative thinking? When are you best at social engagement? When do you have the energy for physical training?
Mhm.
If you start sitting with, like I said, all things being equal, like you don't have all the exogenous artificial things that affect this energetic
Mhm.
flow, and you're just like, okay, if I could organize my day based on my own energetics, this is what I would do, and then do the best you can to do that, because you're going to be much more productive. If
Mhm.
you know between 9 and noon that you're best at focused tasks, well, that's
Mhm.
probably the best time to do focused activities. If you're better at, from 2 to 4 at kind of creative thinking, like you're kind of in an alpha state and you're like loose mentally and you're like, wow, do some creative thinking there. That's probably when you want to do your creative thinking. Now, you can use exogenous materials to influence and support some of those activities, but you want to do them mindfully. So, most of us drink coffee or caffeinated beverages to get the day started. Well, imagine if you didn't do that as a habit, but you did it to support a particular activity at a particular
Mhm.
time, for a time constrained period of time. So it's not like you're drinking coffee every day, but like,
Mhm.
I need to focus. I know caffeine does this, whatever this does for me, and I'm going to focus for these few hours, or use nicotine. Now, you can like biohack. You can use exogenous
Right.
chemicals to biohack for, increasing your focus, or increasing your creativity, or, some people in Silicon Valley microdose psychedelics as examples. You're not getting the full psychedelic
Mhm.
effect, but you're increasing the likelihood of creative thinking. So there are things, it's not legal, but that aside, there are things you can do
Right.
with exogenous chemicals to influence your own energetic flows. But the first thing you need to do is figure out, okay, what are my natural energetic flows in any particular day? And if you start doing this inquiry, don't limit it to a 24-hour period of time. Because I've worked with this with some clients, and they find that they are really good at like 2 or 3 days of intensely focused work. I don't mean 24 hours a day for 3 days, but like,
Right.
a work day, a full work day, they're really intense work for 2 or 3 days, and then they need 2 or 3 days off. But they accomplish so much in those 3 days that it's easy, they can take those 2 or 3 days off because either they work for themselves or their boss is smart enough to recognize that this works
Right.
for them to get to be ultimately productive. So that's one example of, first of all, you want them to live within the natural 24-hour day and night cycle as
Mhm.
best as possible, and then be aware of your own energetic cycles, and then organize your life accordingly.
And organize it, because what you're doing is you're organizing life, and how all of this affects your body.
Mm-hmm.
This is very interesting. We're almost at an hour here, and
Cool.
Mike, I can go on for another 5 hours. I'm going to ask you to come back on
Cool. Would love
again,
to.
because
Yep.
there's just so much to talk about. So let me ask you one more question.
Yeah.
What is it that you want to communicate to the audience that you think is important that we haven't discussed?
As challenging as COVID is on multiple different levels,
Mm-hmm.
it also gives us the opportunity, if we take it seriously, especially the silence, which you've already
Mm-hmm.
articulated how important it is, if we sit with and reflect upon how we organize our lives, how we think about ourselves first, how we organize our lives, the institutions we work within, the systems we operate within,
Mm-hmm.
gives us a chance to reimagine all those things
Right.
in light of what we now know, which would optimize human health and well-being. Because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
our mediating institutions, and we can talk about this at another time, are
Yes.
actually counter to
Yes.
human health and well-being.
Right.
And now's the opportunity to rethink everything, including our personal lives, our family lives, and then scale from there.
That is another
Yep.
podcast that we can do, and
Yep.
we could probably have 3 parts to that podcast, because you
Exactly.
you you and I have so many different different thoughts on that. And
Exactly.
you know, and that is the truest thing. Whoever's listening to this, it's the truest thing that you're going to hear today, is to reimagine through all of this, you know, stuff with COVID. So, Mike, let me ask you another question. How can my listeners contact you if they want to do coaching with you? How can they contact you?
A couple of different ways. You can go to my website, Michael D as in David, but just the D, Ostrolenk, OSTROLENK. So it's michaeldostrolenk.com. And you can find out about my coaching work, my transpartisan work, everything's there. And there's also a way to contact me on that website as well. And for anyone else who's on social media, you can find me on Twitter, unfortunately too much, at M Ostrolenk. So it's M, my first initial, my first name, M Ostrolenk, OSTROLENK. And I do a lot of work for other people on Twitter, but I also do a lot of my own stuff on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And you will find the wide variety of issues that I work with and interests that I have by seeing what I tweet about on a daily basis.
You know what, all of our listeners, I want you to contact Mike. You know, he's got a world of knowledge. You can see the knowledge, skill, education, the training, experience, the passion that comes out. So I want everybody to contact Mike and use him as a coach, because I think it's so important, his work and what he does. Mike, thank you very much. It's been truly an honor and a pleasure. We're going to have you come back on. There's so much to talk about. We can do different types of segments. I'm thinking about different types of segments that we can do,
awesome.
and we can have a good time. We can motivate, we can educate, and we can inspire. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Dan, for having me. I appreciate it.
All of our listeners, go to YouTube, Suburban Wellness Group. Don't miss an episode. Thank you again, Mike, and we will talk to everybody soon. Take care now.